Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. If you're familiar with the channel, it should be abundantly clear that the margin for error between life and death underwater is small, and so it should come as no surprise that you probably wouldn't want to be at the forefront of such a dangerous industry. So in this video, we're going to look at two stories of people who are exactly that, and the results were horrifying. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Quickly, before we get into the video, you may remember the Arctic horror podcast I recommended on several occasions by Fool and Scholar Productions called The White Vault. The response for that recommendation was overwhelmingly positive from the people who listened to it. So today, I'd like to introduce you to a new story they're working on called Don't Mind. Don't Mind is an anthology mystery podcast where each season takes them to a remote community and an underlying mystery surrounding it. The recently released season, called Sealskin Rock, follows a family that moves to a Canadian chateau located on an island off the New Brunswick coast. They've been hired to repair the old manor, but as they discover more about the island's gruesome history, the renovations become the least of their worries. Don't Mind is also created by the same award-winning team behind The White Vault, winning numerous awards for sound design and acting. And the stories even feature actresses and actors you might recognize. Like, for example, Adjo Ando from Bridgerton and The Witcher is the co-star of the first season, Cruxmont. And if you're a Mass Effect fan, Mark Meer, who plays Commander Shepard, is one of the co-stars of Sealskin Rock. Don't Mind, Sealskin Rock is available wherever you find podcasts, and you can hear the first several episodes out now and subsequent episodes every 2 weeks. Or if you prefer, you can listen to them right here on the Fool and Scholar Productions YouTube channel. And if you want even more content to binge, you can hear the entirety of their first story, Don't Mind Cruxmont, which follows a man searching for his brother in a small English village that harbors a dark secret its citizens will do anything to protect. So check out Don't Mind Cruxmont or Don't Mind Sealskin Rock right now using the links in the description below. And a huge thank you to Fool and Scholar for sponsoring this video. The 1700s were an era of grand ambitions and reckless speculation. Trade routes expanded, cities flourished, and the British Empire reached across the seas. Wealth, once only reserved for aristocrats, began to trickle into the hands of merchants and entrepreneurs, but with new opportunities came new schemes, some ingenious and others disastrously misguided. Among the many dreamers of this age was a man named John Day. He was a carpenter and wheelwright from East Anglia, and an unremarkable man by most accounts, except for his unshakable belief that he could make history. He saw himself as an inventor, a visionary, and most dangerously, a man destined for fame. While others sought wealth through trade or politics, his plan was to build a submersible chamber, sink it to the depths of the ocean, and prove that a man could survive underwater for hours at a time. And if he succeeded, he would not only claim a fortune, but secure his place in history as a pioneer of deep-sea exploration. John, however, had no formal education, no engineering background, and no particular expertise in maritime science. All he really had was an idea. His great obsession was submersion, specifically the idea that a man could survive beneath the water if only he were enclosed in a sufficiently airtight chamber. John also claimed to have already proven this theory through a previous experiment. According to his own account, he had taken an old fishing boat, refitted it with an interior watertight compartment, and then, when it was ready, placed it in shallow water, sealed himself inside, and let the tide come in. He purportedly remained inside the chamber for a few hours as the tide completely submerged the ship. And this would be an impressive feat, if it actually happened. Unfortunately, as these stories often go, there were no witnesses to verify his claims. And so naturally, there were many skeptics. Any shipwright with a basic understanding of water pressure could have told him that the deeper he went, the greater the force exerted on his makeshift chamber. Any physician could have also warned him about oxygen depletion, but John, convinced of his own brilliance, dismissed the concerns outright. He had done it before, so why not again? And he wasn't the only one willing to take the risk either. Christopher Blake, an English gambler, saw in John's wild ambition a lucrative opportunity. And the two men were equally blinded, one by ambition and the other by greed. John saw himself as a pioneer, a man on the verge of providing a revolutionary concept. Christopher, meanwhile, who is no scientist and showed little care about the feasibility of John's experiment, saw John as an investment and means to a financial windfall. The spectacle of a man sinking beneath the sea in a homemade contraption was the perfect opportunity for betting, and he was eager to place high-stake bets on John's success. Of course, success in this case was defined by one single outcome, whether or not John would resurface alive. So the two quickly struck a deal, and John would build a more sophisticated diving chamber, and this time he'd attach it to the deck of a boat and make a public demonstration of his abilities. Christopher, in turn, would handle the financial end of things, raising funds through bets and promising John a cut of the winnings if he succeeded. To make the experiment possible, Christopher bought a 50-ton boat named Maria for £340 that was described as old but serviceable. Immediately afterward, John set to work modifying it, constructing a wooden diving chamber within the hull. The sealed compartment would end up measuring 12 feet long by 9 feet wide and 8 feet high, or 3.7 meters long by 2.7 meters wide and 2.4 meters high. It was also reinforced with wooden stanchions to withstand the external water pressure, and that was about the extent of the modifications. The chamber had no engine, no external air supply, and no means of communicating with the outside world apart from a rudimentary signaling system. 3 buoys of different colors were affixed to the deck. After submerging, John could send any of the buoys to the surface, with white signaling that all was well, red denoting indifference, and black to signify that John was very unwell underwater. With the contraption built, the dive plan itself seemed straightforward enough. John would climb inside the chamber, bringing with him only a candle, some biscuits, and drinking water. Once sealed inside, the Maria would be weighed down with 60 tons of ballast, 10 tons in the hold, 20 tons on deck, and another 2 10-ton weights attached to the underside of the keel. This immense weight would drag the vessel beneath the surface, taking John to a depth of 130 feet or 40 meters. After 12 hours there, he would pull a rope mechanism from inside, releasing the 2 10-ton weights. With its burden lightened, the Maria would then float back to the surface, where John would emerge triumphant. On paper, it sounded deceptively simple and maybe even plausible to those without a background in seafaring, but in practice, it was a death sentence. John's calculations, if they could even be called that, were riddled with fatal errors. He hadn't accounted for the immense pressure exerted by seawater at depth or the devastating effect it could have on his wooden chamber. He had no contingency for the impact of the tides, which could shift the Maria unpredictably, and most critically, he had overlooked the fact that he would be consuming oxygen in a completely sealed environment. Without an air supply, he would slowly suffocate, trapped in his own creation. Some reports suggest that local shipwrights attempted to warn John of the dangers he had overlooked, but if he took their concerns seriously, it was only for a moment. There are some indications that he reinforced the chamber further at the last minute, but any adjustments he made would have been superficial at best. And still, his confidence remained unshaken. He insisted that he had already proven his concept, citing his previous unverified experiment. Simultaneously, Christopher, despite already losing money on early wagers due to construction delays, also remained undeterred. The crowd was eager for the demonstration, and more bets were placed as the day of the dive approached. Whether people believed in John's success or were simply morbidly fascinated by the possibility of disaster, they came in droves to watch. And for John, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, his chance at fame and fortune, and on June 22nd, 1774, he would climb inside it for the first time. That morning, the Maria was towed out to a deep water location north of Drake's Island in Plymouth Sound. The sky was clear and the sea was calm, perfect conditions for what was meant to be a historic experiment. The atmosphere on shore was charged with anticipation as crowds gathered, and John stood on the deck of the Maria preparing for his descent. He believed in his theory and his calculations and his ability to rise again from the depths. And if he had any last-minute doubts, he kept them to himself. As John got himself ready, Christopher moved among the gathered crowd, collecting any final bets. Some people were certain John would reemerge, and others were convinced that they were about to witness a man willingly bury himself at sea. And Christopher, ever the gambler, was content no matter the outcome. Finally, with preparations complete, John climbed into the small diving chamber, descending into the cramped, airtight space through a small hatch. The opening was then sealed behind him, locking him away from the world above. Then, on deck, the final 20 tons of ballast were loaded, bringing the total weight to 60 tons, more than enough to overcome the buoyancy of the Maria. For a moment afterward, nothing happened. The boat sat eerily still in the water. Then the Maria began to sink, slowly at first and then with growing momentum. It descended beneath the waves, and a frothing, bubbling disturbance marked the spot where it went down. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as the water churned above the spot where John had disappeared. Now all they had to do was wait. To those watching from above, there was no way to know whether he was sitting calmly in his chamber or already struggling for breath. And for the next several hours, the sun rose high in the sky and then began its slow descent toward the horizon as the crowd waited for a sign. The white buoy, meant to signal that all was well, never appeared, and neither did the red nor the black. As the morning of June 22nd turned to afternoon, the crowd along the Plymouth shore stood in uneasy silence, watching the waves where the Maria had disappeared. The boat was supposed to remain submerged for just 12 hours, but then another day went by, and by nightfall, murmurs of doubt rippled through the crowd. As the hours passed without a single disturbance in the water, some onlookers began to leave, convinced that John's grand experiment had ended in disaster. When the morning of June 23rd arrived, John's scheduled reappearance had long passed, and the grim reality could no longer be ignored. Still, there was some hope, however slim. The authorities launched a frantic rescue effort, determined to recover the vessel. Lord Sandwich, First Authority of the Admiralty, ordered all available resources into action. 200 men were then deployed, working tirelessly with cables and dredging equipment to locate and retrieve the Maria. The seafloor was dragged, the water scoured, but there was nothing. Days passed, and still there was no sign of the vessel or its lone occupant. As this was going on, Christopher, who had orchestrated the bets and financed the endeavor, had no intention of waiting around for the inevitable conclusion. As the reality of John's fate became clear, Christopher slipped away from Plymouth, taking with him all the stake money he had collected. He disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a growing scandal. By the time the rescue effort was officially abandoned, John had been lost for 3 days. His dream of making history had in a way been realized. He'd become the first recorded fatality in submarine history. Speculation about what truly happened to John, however, continued. Some believed he died quickly, either from asphyxia or hypothermia. Others were convinced that the Maria had collapsed under the immense water pressure as it sank, which would explain the violent bubbling on the surface just after the descent. If the chamber had been compromised, water would have rushed in instantly, crushing John inside. In the end, though, the exact cause of the disaster has never been confirmed. The Maria and John had vanished into the depths, and as of today, the ship and any remnants of it have still never been located. The Bay of Biscay is off the western coasts of France and Spain and is beautiful on the surface, but its waters hide a brutal legacy. Near the end of World War II, British and American forces turned the bay into a submarine slaughterhouse. Dozens of German U-boats became steel coffins after relentless aerial bombardments. Add to that the handful of Allied and Axis submarines lost during World War I, and you've got one of the most densely packed undersea graveyards in naval history. But in 1970, the bay claimed something much more dangerous. Unlike the diesel-powered vessels of earlier wars, the Soviet submarine K-8 didn't run on fumes and engine grease. It was instead nuclear. And armed with 2 onboard reactors and carrying 4 torpedoes tipped with nuclear warheads, the K-8 was part of a new kind of underwater warfare with greater consequences than ever before. These November-class submarines, known in Soviet terms as the Project 627 boats, were their first serious swing at nuclear-powered attack subs. The K-8 was one of these, the third in fact, and it bore all the hallmarks of the class, boasting speed, range, menace, and a whole lot of noise. The November-class subs were also massive compared to their American counterparts. They displaced 4,700 tons submerged and could hit speeds of 30 knots, which wasn't bad for something that moved like an underwater freight train, because they were also clunky and messy, and they had the hydrodynamic efficiency of cinder blocks. And again, the November class was also loud. It wasn't just that they couldn't sneak up on anything, it was more like they announced their presence from across the ocean. This didn't matter all that much initially because these submarines were originally built for one grim singular purpose: to launch a long-range nuclear-tipped torpedo at Western ports. The Soviets envisioned a megaweapon, an oversized torpedo called the T-15 that could strike from 40 kilometers away and level a harbor with a single blast. But soon enough, as anti-submarine warfare got better and NATO's ears got sharper, the idea of slipping one of these noisy giants close enough to a NATO base became laughable, so the mission changed. The November class was then retooled for conventional warfare, or as conventional as Cold War submarine combat could be. Instead of sneak attacks on ports, their job was now to go after enemy surface ships, particularly NATO convoys. And if that sounds like a death mission, you're probably right. While a November-class sub could unleash chaos on a convoy with its nuclear-armed torpedoes, it probably wasn't making it back home afterward. Their sonar was subpar, their acoustics were awful, and their stealth profile was in simplest terms a joke. To cap it all, the ship was also unstable, and before long, the sea and its own systems would start to push back. After its launch, the K-8 didn't have to wait long to meet disaster. In October 1960, barely a year into service, the ship nearly didn't come home. In the cold Barents Sea on October 13th, deep below the surface, a rupture in one of the steam generator tubes turned a routine patrol into a nuclear crisis. The rupture triggered a loss of coolant accident, which is a nuclear engineer's worst nightmare. Without cooling water, the reactor core would overheat, melt, and possibly explode. Think Chernobyl, but under several hundred feet of seawater with no hope of evacuation. The men on board, though, to their credit, didn't panic. Instead, they improvised. Using whatever tools they had, the crew jerry-rigged a cooling system, diverting emergency water into the overheated reactor. This worked, but barely. The core didn't melt down and the boat didn't become a floating tomb, but the cost of survival was a steep one. In the process of saving the submarine, radioactive gas escaped into the compartments. This flooded the vessel like poison fog, and radiation levels were so high that the instruments on board couldn't even register the full extent, they just maxed out. 3 sailors developed visible radiation burns, and many more were dosed with upwards of 1.8 to 2 sieverts, a level that causes serious health problems and sometimes even death. But despite this, all of them had to keep functioning inside that steel drum while it carried them home. Afterward, the incident was quietly logged and the K-8 was patched up, systems were repaired, orders were resumed, and like so many Cold War machines, the K-8 was sent back out again. In the spring of 1970, the Soviet Union decided it was time to flex its muscles again. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of missiles and ideology, it was also of performance and displays of technological superiority. And Operation Okine 70 was meant to do exactly that. At the time, it was the largest naval exercise in Soviet history. And the goal was simple: prove that the Soviet Navy could project power anywhere at any time, and that it wasn't just a coastal defense force anymore. And as a result, the scale of the exercise was staggering. 200 ships from the Northern Baltic, Black Sea, and Pacific fleets took part. 60 surface vessels and 40 submarines were deployed by the Northern Fleet alone. The K-8 was among these, dispatched to the North Atlantic with 24 torpedoes, including 4 nuclear warheads. This wasn't too unusual. Nuclear-tipped weapons were standard issue for Soviet subs on extended patrol, but it added an ominous weight to everything that followed. Also, the mission in essence was a modern echo of an old one: disrupt NATO convoys and sever the supply line between the United States and Western Europe. Just as German U-boats had prowled the Atlantic 3 decades earlier, now it was the K-8's turn to patrol the depths armed with far deadlier tools. The differences, however, were also stark. Those U-boats were loud and lethal, but they weren't glowing with radiation, and their crews weren't operating in experimental machines with barely tested nuclear systems and questionable redundancy. And on April 8th, these issues came to the forefront once again. It started with 2 fires, simultaneous outbreaks in compartments 3 and 7 at 394 feet or 120 meters below the surface. Whether due to faulty wiring, aging systems, or the randomness of fate, the result was chaos. The fire spread quickly through the submarine's air conditioning ducts, snaking through the hull. Both of the nuclear reactors then shut down as smoke and heat filled the sub's interior, and that could only mean one thing: the ship was dead in the water. So Captain Besanov, faced with a crippled, burning submarine, gave the only order that made sense: abandon the ship. Before that could even be done though, 8 men trapped in burning or flooded compartments were already gone. The rest of the crew then evacuated onto the surface in lifeboats in rough seas and watched the vessel sputter in place. Against all odds though, a glimmer of hope showed up just in time. It was a Soviet repair vessel, but saving the K-8 came with a catch. Someone would have to go back on board. And by this point, the K-8 was no longer a submarine, it was a furnace wrapped in steel. After the fires broke out and the reactor shut down, the boat lost its power. There was no propulsion, no control, and no filtration. Just heat, smoke, and the knowledge that nuclear weapons were sitting in a crippled vessel floating in the middle of the North Atlantic. When the order to abandon ship was given, it wasn't taken lightly. The men of the K-8 knew the risks of leaving their boat adrift, but they also knew that staying meant dying either by fire, radiation, or suffocation. Besanov, a career officer known for steadiness under pressure, was faced with a brutal decision once the repair vessel arrived. He could either let the submarine go down along with its 4 nuclear torpedoes or try to save it and risk more lives. He would end up choosing trying to save it. This was either an act of extraordinary courage or extraordinary command pressure, depending on who you ask. Soviet doctrine didn't leave a lot of room for walking away from a mission, even if it meant stepping back into a toxic, partially flooded tomb. But from the outside, reboarding the K could look like a daring rescue. Soviet naval brass could frame this as a testament to courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. But for the men who climbed back aboard, doing so was only about duty. It was about not letting their ship sink into the abyss without a fight, and so 52 sailors, including Besanov, stepped back onto a scorched, crippled submarine floating dead in a churning sea. It must have felt like they were walking into a trap. The fires had been put out, but the damage was far from over. There was no power, no air, and no working pumps. Every breath was filled with carbon monoxide, but still, they tried to save the K-8. The sailors sealed off flooded compartments, patched hull breaches with whatever scrap metals they could find, and tried to make the boat towable. For 3 days and nights, they worked through exhaustion and nausea, clinging to the hope that they could save the sub, or at least keep it afloat long enough to reach home, but the odds were impossible. Storm conditions that rolled in made towing the K-8 a nightmare. The line strained and snapped, and the repair vessel could only do so much as the seas heaved and pitched. And inside the submarine, morale and oxygen were both running dangerously low. And worst of all, the nuclear torpedoes were still aboard. There was just no safe way to remove them. The weapons were locked in place deep inside the sub. That made the stakes even higher, not just for the crew, but for the environment, the surrounding ships, and the global political powder keg that was the Cold War. If the K went down, it wouldn't just take sailors with it, it would take radioactive material all the way to the ocean floor. So, still, the sailors stayed. For 80 brutal hours, the men aboard the K worked against the inevitable. Every one of them knew what was coming, maybe not the exact time or the final trigger, but they weren't stupid. they knew what kind of fate awaited them. On April 12th, as the storm battered the surface and systems failed one by one, the K-8 slipped below the waves and all 52 men disappeared into the deep. The gamble had not paid off, or maybe it had never really been a gamble. Either way, to the men aboard, it didn't matter. On the surface, the 73 crew who had been evacuated but weren't part of the salvage team knew intimately what sort of fate their fellow crewmen had just suffered. Their names would never be household ones, and their stories would barely trickle through the Iron Curtain, but the physical and psychological scars ran deep. They had watched their shipmates go back aboard, knowing they might not return. There were also no memorials for the K-8 in the years that followed, and there were no plaques in the Bay of Biscay. Just silence at a depth of 15,354 feet, or 4,680 meters below the surface, where the K-8 still rests to this day. Officially, the Soviet Union said very little. In the wake of the K-8 sinking, there was no sweeping reforms or televised tributes or even acknowledgements of the failure. Just paperwork filed behind closed doors and survivors who were told in the usual roundabout way to move on. Simultaneously, internally, the loss rattled the Soviet Navy. It was a combat-ready submarine and one of the first nuclear-powered attack class, and the ship hadn't been sunk by enemy action. The November class as a whole had already earned a reputation for being dangerously noisy and technologically outdated. The K-8's demise only confirmed what many had already suspected. These boats were not suited for the complex demands of long-range patrols and deep-sea warfare. They were essentially Cold War relics before the Cold War was even half over. And yet, at the same time, the mission the K-8 was on, which was the severing of NATO's Atlantic supply chain, remained central to Soviet naval strategy. Submarines would continue to be built, deployed, and lost, with each disaster offering grim lessons that slowly pushed the technology forward. One of the most sobering elements of the K-8 tragedy wasn't just the human loss, it was what went down with it. 4 nuclear torpedoes. To this day, they remain on the seafloor, sealed inside a pressure-hardened steel coffin at a depth of nearly 3 miles or 5 kilometers. No one knows exactly what condition they're in because no one's gone down to check. Maybe they're stable, maybe not. And for the West, the story of the K-8 barely registered. It was just another Soviet sub lost under mysterious circumstances. In the years that followed, newer classes like the Victor and Alpha would replace the Novembers, which were sleeker, quieter, and more reliable. But the price for those advances was steep, and it was paid in full by the crew of the K-8.